This is the Battle of Isandlwana, one of the most shocking defeats in British imperial history. A modern army, drilled and armed with breech-loading rifles, is annihilated by warriors wielding spears and shields. How did it happen? In the late 1870s, the British Empire was at its height. Red on the map stretched across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. London wanted to knit southern Africa into a single confederation under British control. But one kingdom stood in the way, the Zulu nation. The Zulu Kingdom, forged by Shaka earlier in the century, was no mere tribal enclave. It was a disciplined, militarized society with tens of thousands of trained warriors. Its king in 1879, Cetshwayo Compand, ruled a realm of order and fear. He had inherited Shaka's regimental system, reorganizing age groups into fighting units called amabutho. These were not irregular bands but permanent barracks-based regiments drilled in formation fighting. Sir Henry Bartle Frere, the British High Commissioner, saw the Zulus as an obstacle to his confederation plan. He also saw an opportunity, a quick war to crush the kingdom and open Natal to British settlers. In December 1878, the British delivered an ultimatum to Cetshwayo demanding that he disband his army. It was impossible for the king to comply without losing his throne. In January 1879, British columns crossed the Buffalo River and invaded Zululand. The main invading force, the center column, was commanded by Lieutenant General Lord Chelmsford. It numbered about 4,700 troops, including 2 battalions of regular British infantry, Colonial volunteers, and African auxiliaries. With breech-loading rifles, artillery, and rocket batteries, they believed they could brush aside any Zulu resistance. But the Zulus were watching. Cetshwayo had called up his full army, about 20,000 warriors, and sent them to shadow Chelmsford's advance. They were commanded by veteran Indunas such as Ncingwayo Kamahole and Mavumengwana Kandlila. The Zulus moved with secrecy and speed, living off the land, hidden in the rolling hills. They intended to strike when the British least expected it. This collision, an empire confident in its modern firepower and a kingdom steeped in disciplined aggression, would erupt at a lonely hill called Isandlwana on January 22, 1879. Lord Chelmsford's center column crossed into Zululand on January 11. His plan was to march to the royal kraal at Ulundi and force the king to surrender. The column moved slowly, dragging wagons and supplies. At every camp they built a laager, an improvised fortification with wagons and earthworks, but discipline slackened. Isandlwana was a distinctive, sphinx-shaped hill rising from the plain. On January 20th the column camped at its base. The hill gave good visibility but the camp was sprawling and unfortified. Chelmsford, convinced the Zulu army was far away, split his forces. Before dawn on January 22nd, he took about half his men eastward to scout, leaving the camp under the command of Colonel Henry Pulliaine of the 24th Regiment. Pulliaine had around 1,700 men, including 6 companies of the 124th and February 24th Th, 2 guns of the Royal Artillery, some Natal native contingent, NC, troops, and wagon drivers. He had orders to defend the camp, but no laager had been formed and ammunition was scattered among the wagons. Meanwhile, just a few miles away, the main Zulu army was hidden in a valley near the Ngweni River. 20,000 warriors crouched in the tall grass, waiting. Their commanders had planned to attack Chelmsford's divided force the next day. But early on January 22nd, a British scouting party stumbled upon their hiding place. The Zulu regiments rose like a dark wave. Indunas blew horns and waved sticks. The hunt had begun. The Zulu army's tactical system was a masterpiece of simplicity. The main force, the chest, would pin the enemy front. 2 wings, the horns, would sweep around to encircle. A reserve, the loins, waited behind the crest, ready to exploit a breakthrough. Warriors moved at a trot, singing war songs to keep formation. Orders were relayed by runners and hand signals. Each warrior carried a large cowhide shield and an ikua, a short stabbing spear named for the sucking sound it made when withdrawn from a wound. They also carried a throwing spear and some had captured firearms, but their real weapon was speed and shock. Before battle, they smeared their bodies with fat and wore plumes of ox tails or crane feathers. The sight of tens of thousands advancing in unison was terrifying. At Isandlwana, the Zulus were divided into 11 regiments. The elite Unokenk, Umbanambai, and Ingobamakosi formed the chest. The Umsijo and Udloko formed the right horn. The Inluyengwi and Imbyub formed the left horn. The Uthulwana and Inluyengwa waited in reserve. Each regiment had its own colors and chants. The commanders knew their roles perfectly. In the camp, Colonel Puliane received reports of Zulus moving on the hills. He sent out companies to investigate but underestimated the threat. When Major Anthony Durnford rode in with 500 men from Rorke's Drift, he took command of the Natal native horse and went forward to reconnoiter, leaving the camp's perimeter weakened. British officers believed that with rifles and artillery they could hold any number of spear-armed warriors. But their line extended over a mile, with gaps between companies. Ammunition wagons were far to the rear. The Natal native contingent, African levies armed mostly with spears, were unreliable and nervous. Shortly after 11 a.m., dust clouds rose from the north. Lookouts saw black masses of Zulus pouring over the ridge. The horns of the buffalo were spreading. The trap was closing. Shortly after 11 a.m., a low humming began on the northern ridge. The sound was thousands of voices singing war chants. Then the Zulu army appeared, black ranks cresting the hills like storm clouds. British officers pulled out field glasses and stared. The few Zulus their scouts had reported were now tens of thousands. Colonel Puliane ordered the camp alarm sounded. Companies of the 24th Regiment moved out of their tents and formed firing lines. The two 7-pounder guns were dragged to the front. Mounted volunteers galloped along the perimeter. The air filled with the bark of orders, the jingle of equipment, the click of rifle breeches. At 11:30 the guns boomed. Shells burst among the leading Zulu regiments. Martini, Henry rifles cracked like whips, spitting smoke. The front ranks of warriors went down, but the columns behind kept coming. They trotted steadily, shields forward, spears glinting. The main Zulu force, the chest, pushed straight at the British center. They moved at a run, dropped to one knee, then rose again, a living wave absorbing casualties. For nearly an hour they were pinned by rifle fire. Puliane's line held, pouring volley after volley into the dark mass. Officers shouted, "Independent fire," and soldiers shot as fast as they could load. The Zulus fell in heaps, but their discipline did not break. They lay flat to reload muskets, rolled to avoid shells, and used folds in the ground as cover. The horns of the buffalo began to creep outward, beyond the British flanks. On the right flank, Major Durnford's mounted Natal horse and African auxiliaries tried to check the encircling horn. They fired from horseback, dismounted, fired again, and fell back in skirmish order. For a time they slowed the Zulu advance. But ammunition began to run low. Durnford sent urgent messages back to camp. "Send more cartridges." The wagons were still locked and the system for distributing ammunition was painfully slow. When the mounted troops finally ran dry, they withdrew to the camp. The right flank was open. The Zulu horn swept around, cutting off the line of retreat to the river. By early afternoon, the British center was also running low. The soldiers had fired hundreds of rounds. Boxes of cartridges were stacked on wagons but required special screwdrivers to open. Couriers ran back and forth. Quartermasters, overwhelmed by the chaos, issued rounds too slowly. Some companies received none at all. As the volume of fire slackened, the Zulu chest sensed weakness. Warriors rose from cover and charged. Their war cries, "Usuthu," echoed off the hill. The front ranks of redcoats fixed bayonets. The two guns fired canister at point-blank range, tearing gaps but not stopping the surge. At about 1:30 p.m., the right horn closed completely around the camp, cutting off Durnford and the native contingents. Panic spread. The Natal auxiliaries broke and ran, throwing down their weapons. With the flanks exposed, the Zulu chest smashed into the center. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted. Bayonets met spears. Men clubbed with rifle butts. Puliine tried to form a new line closer to the tents, but the movement turned into a rout. Officers were cut down. Companies dissolved into knots of men fighting back to back. The Zulu left horn had now swung behind the camp, sealing every escape except a narrow path toward the Buffalo River. Tents collapsed under the press of warriors. The ammunition wagons were overrun before their boxes could be opened. Gunners tried to spike their own artillery pieces but were speared at their posts. Wagon drivers and civilians grabbed rifles and fired from behind ox wagons until they were dragged out and killed. The Zulus moved with terrifying efficiency, one regiment pinning, another enveloping, a third surging through gaps. Their short stabbing spears were deadly in close quarters. They stabbed low, under the ribs, just as Shaka had taught. Within minutes, the British position dissolved into 100 small last stands. Groups of redcoats fought their way to the rocky slopes of Isandlwana and formed rally squares. Sergeant Anthony Clark described the scene later. "We fought like lions, but they were too many. Men fired their last rounds, fixed bayonets, and went down under a rain of spears. A few companies managed a fighting withdrawal toward the river. Durnford's men held a donga, a dry gully, for nearly an hour, firing from cover, until they were overwhelmed. Durnford himself was found later with empty cartridge cases all around him, his revolver still in hand. Near the camp's edge, Colonel Puliine was killed rallying his men. The regimental colors of the 124th disappeared in the melee. One set buried under bodies, another carried off and lost. A narrow gap remained near the saddle between Isandlwana and a smaller copy. Through it, hundreds of survivors ran for their lives. Zulu warriors pursued, cutting down stragglers. Those who reached the Buffalo River found it in flood, chest deep and churning. Men threw off equipment and waded across under a hail of spears. A handful of mounted men galloped to safety at Helpmakar. Others drowned or were killed on the far bank. Only about 60 Europeans and a few hundred African auxiliaries escaped out of more than 1,700 in the camp. By mid-afternoon, the battle was over. The camp was a scene of horror, bodies piled among wagons, broken rifles, torn tents. The Zulus moved silently among the dead, stripping uniforms and taking weapons. As was custom, they ritually disemboweled the fallen to release their spirits. They spared very few prisoners. The cost to the Zulus was also heavy, perhaps 1,000 to 3,000 killed and wounded, but they had destroyed an entire British column. It was the greatest defeat ever inflicted by an indigenous African army on a modern European force. When Lord Chelmsford returned that evening with his half of the column, he saw the vultures circling and knew disaster had struck. The sight of the camp stunned him. Thousands of corpses, wagons overturned, guns silent. He ordered an immediate withdrawal under cover of darkness. News of Isandlwana reached Britain weeks later and caused an uproar. How could spear-armed warriors annihilate a modern army? The defeat shattered the myth of imperial invincibility and gave the Zulu Kingdom its greatest triumph. When Chelmsford's detachment stumbled back toward the Buffalo River on the evening of January 22nd, the sky was already dark. They had heard the distant gunfire all day, but could not believe the camp had fallen until they crested a rise and saw Isandlwana by moonlight. Wagons were overturned like toys. The hill was littered with thousands of bodies, redcoats, auxiliaries, wagon drivers, horses, oxen. The stillness was eerie, broken only by the moans of wounded men and the low chanting of Zulu war songs in the distance. Chelmsford's men bivouacked in square formation through the night, expecting the Zulus to attack them as well. In reality, the main Zulu army had already melted away into the hills, exhausted but exultant. They had achieved a victory no African force had ever managed: the destruction of a modern European column in open battle. In Natal and the British Cape Colony, panic spread like wildfire. Settlers packed their belongings and fled. Newspapers screamed of massacre in Zululand. Reinforcements were rushed from Britain and from other colonies. Queen Victoria's government faced questions in Parliament. How could this happen under the Union Jack? Yet on the same day as Isandlwana, another drama unfolded a few miles away at the tiny mission station of Rorke's Drift. There, a mere 150 British soldiers, many of them sick or on convalescence, fended off 4,000 Zulu warriors for nearly 12 hours behind hastily built barricades. Their defense became the bright counterpoint to the disaster, hailed as an epic of British courage. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded for Rorke's Drift. The juxtaposition of these two events, catastrophic defeat at Isandlwana, desperate stand at Rorke's Drift, created a narrative the British public could accept, imperial tragedy redeemed by heroism. But the truth on the ground was that the Zulus had inflicted a strategic shock that would take months to reverse. Cetshwayo, the Zulu king, had not sought war. He had ordered his commanders to fight defensively and not cross into Natal. After Isandlwana, he sent envoys to Chelmsford offering peace. But the British were now committed to total victory. Reinforcements poured in: regular infantry, cavalry, engineers, and more artillery. By March 1879, a second invasion of Zululand was underway. This time the British advanced more cautiously, building fortified camps, securing supply lines, and using Gatling guns and rockets. The Zulus fought bravely in several battles, but their losses mounted. On July 4, 1879 at Ulundi, the British formed a massive square and unleashed withering fire on the last great Zulu assault. Thousands were killed. The Zulu Kingdom's military power was broken. Cetshwayo was captured and exiled. Within a decade, Zululand was annexed and the regimental system abolished. The proud independent kingdom forged by Shaka ceased to exist as a sovereign state. Yet the memory of Isandlwana did not fade. For Britain, it was a warning about overconfidence and poor logistics. Splitting forces, neglecting fortifications, and underestimating an enemy's skill had cost a column its life. For Africa, it was a moment of vindication, a demonstration that disciplined indigenous warriors could defeat European troops under the right conditions. Even today, the battlefield at Isandlwana is eerily quiet. White cairns mark the mass graves of British soldiers. Scattered stone circles mark where Zulu regiments rallied. The sphinx-shaped hill looms above it all, unchanged since that January day. Historians still debate the exact number of Zulu warriors, the true casualty figures, and whether the defeat was inevitable. But one thing is clear: the Battle of Isandlwana stands as one of the most dramatic reversals of imperial fortune in the Victorian era. On that windswept plain in 1879, two worlds collided, one armed with breech-loading rifles and artillery, the other with spears and shields and an iron discipline drilled for generations. For a few hours on January 22nd, the assumptions of empire were shattered. The horns of the buffalo closed, and an army that believed itself invincible was swept away. If you visit Isandlwana today, you can still stand on the slope where the last redcoats fought, feel the wind over the grass, and imagine the chants of the Amabutho rolling down from the hills. It is a place of ghosts and lessons. The story of the Zulu victory is not just about tactics. It's about leadership, discipline, and the cost of underestimating an opponent. It's also about courage on both sides. British soldiers held their ground until overwhelmed. Zulu warriors charged into rifle fire again and again. The field became a grave for arrogance, bravery, and tragedy alike. If you've enjoyed this journey into one of history's most dramatic battles, subscribe to the channel for more untold stories of war and empire. In our next episode, we'll look at another stunning reversal of fortune. History is full of battles where the unexpected happens. Isandlwana remains one of the most unforgettable,